Hello, and welcome to Ipsa Dixit, a podcast on legal scholarship. I'm your host, Brian L. Fry, Spears Gilbert Associate Professor of Law at the University of Kentucky College of Law. My guest is Greg Shill, Associate Professor of Law at the University of Iowa College of Law. We will discuss his article, Should Law Subsidize Driving?, which will be published by the NYU Law Review. So welcome to the podcast, Greg.
Thanks, Brian. Great to be here.
Yeah, so as you know, I'm a huge fan of this paper, which I think is both incredibly substantively important, but also incredibly moving. And I hope we can get into both of those in the course of the podcast. But I got to say, I also really love your deployment of Betteridge's Law in the title of your paper, because really the answer couldn't be a more forceful no. Right? I mean, the question is, should law subsidize driving? And that's not a hypothetical question, even. So I was wondering if you could start by just sort of, in a broad sense, talking a little bit about how law subsidizes driving, because not all of the examples that you give are really intuitive. And I think maybe if you frame for listeners kind of how you're conceptualizing subsidies, it might be helpful for people to understand the argument that you're making.
Absolutely. I think the framing I chose is a provocative one, not for the mere reason to provoke, but because I want to get people to ask themselves whether the law does play favorites with transportation modes, which is not a topic that has been addressed thus far in the literature. There's a planning literature on it. There's an economics literature, sociology, and so forth, but not law as such. So to frame it, I think it's probably helpful to talk about the status quo. Most of us drive every day, but we are numb, I think, to the toll. So nothing except heart disease and cancer claims more lives in the United States than motor vehicles. For each of the last 3 years, 40,000 people per year have been killed in car crashes. About a quarter of those are outside the vehicle, and about 30,000 are drivers and passengers. On top of that, and that's a statistic you may have seen, it's been in the papers a lot because it's been increasing, which is also a uniquely U.S. trend relative to our wealthy peers. On top of that, there's another 53,000 people that are killed every year by emissions. And here I'm not just talking about tailpipe emissions, but also other types of vehicle emissions, such as from brake pads and tires, that are responsible for about 85 and 90% of particulate matter that is generated by cars and that can cause cancer and myriad other health problems. So we're talking about a universe of about 93,000 deaths per year. So way more than guns or opioids. And on top of that, we have another set of injuries that is around 4.5 million every year, 4.5 million serious injuries requiring medical attention. So this is, to me, plainly a public health crisis. It is rarely talked about as such. To quantify it, the U.S. Department of Transportation has a methodology of determining how much a life is worth. So just looking at the deaths, not looking at the millions and millions of injuries and many other second-order effects, about $893 billion a year is stolen from our economy, and really from our social system, from our society, by cars. It's crashes, but it's also emissions. And that it wipes out the GDP of 11 U.S. states. So we're a 39-state country in this regard, and we haven't even gotten into the distribution of those losses, which fall most heavily on the most vulnerable, people with disabilities, children, the elderly, people who are poor, and people of color.
And so in the paper, you argue on many different levels and in many different areas that these aren't just incidental costs, but actually costs that are imposed or at least increased by policy choices that we actually made intentionally, or maybe in some cases by sort of almost quasi accidentally falling into those choices. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the different areas, kind of broadly speaking, in which you see the subsidy of cars, the kind of official subsidy of cars, as being most egregious.
Yeah, so I think we're aware, at least at a high level, of the fiscal subsidies for cars for the last 50 to 80 years. Here I'm talking about diverting public transit money to highways, using so-called urban renewal funds for highways, making highways free while continuing to jack up fares for underperforming transit and so forth. So we could have a whole policy conversation about it, but you're absolutely right. And that's really the focus of the paper is to talk about the law. How does the law do this? It has policy origins, which are relatively well known. Then there are also cultural origins as well. My claim is not that law is the primary vector here, but rather that it cements these pre-existing preferences and also legitimizes them, because it gives us a way to say, you know what, that's okay. It's okay that this 3-year-old was killed by a reckless driver who faced no jail time and a trivial fine, because that's inevitable. It's an accident. Even that word, of course, implies exculpation. So the categories that I talk about in the paper are numerous. And I should mention here that this is going to become a book project. It will be published. A version of the draft that's on SSRN will be published in the NYU Law Review, which I'm thrilled about. But I've also been approached by publishers about writing a book based on the same subject, which is something that I'm pursuing, where I can expand a little bit more on it. So some of these areas of law that subsidize driving, the first that I talk about in the paper, which no legal academic has not talked about to date, is traffic law. The extremely boring and mundane everyday process of determining what is a lawful turn and what is not, what is a lawful speed, what is not, and also the gap between what is lawful and what is enforced. So the paper, I start talking about speed limits. We all know that speed limits are not enforced in a sincere way. They are what a colleague of mine in a recent paper has called an example of insincere rules. There isn't a jurisdiction in the country where most people will get a ticket for going 1 mile an hour over the speed limit, or even 10 miles an hour. There is data on this, and it is common to not receive a ticket under the 10 mile an hour over the limit mark, which tracks, I think, most people's personal experience. So that's well known. What's not well known is the process for setting and resetting speed limits. That's done usually in the first instance by statute, but then they are adjusted with great flexibility by local departments of transportation. And they're adjusted in accordance with something called the MUTCD, which is the Federal Highway Administration's Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices. This is a thrilling document, which is probably why you don't see a lot of scholarship on it outside of the engineering space, and to some extent public health. It's in its 9th decade now. It's been revised a number of times. It is ancient in many respects. It does not include many discussions of safety. It's really focused on motorist convenience and minimizing motorist delay. For purposes of speed limits, this manifests through something called the 85th percentile rule, which provides that a speed limit will be set by statute and then adjusted based on the 85th percentile of speed at which cars are traveling in free-moving traffic on the road. So to make this concrete, if you're in a residential area, the speed limit is 30 miles an hour. Most people drive 35. We'll even say at rush hour, it slows down to 25. That's not free-moving traffic under the definition in the MUTCD. Free-moving traffic is at 35 if 85% of the drivers are going 35, then the speed limit will be bumped up to 35.
Hmm.
If that happens again, so once it's bumped up, let's say the 85th percentile shifts to 40 miles an hour, the local DOT will often bump it up again to 40 miles an hour. And now you're at a speed where most people, if hit by a car, will die.
Mm-hmm.
There's a huge drop off in survivability from 30 miles an hour to 40 miles an hour. There's also one, by the way, between 20 and 30, especially for senior citizens.
Mm-hmm.
But this is a process that is ostensibly mechanical, but it's only mechanical because local DOTs choose to apply this federal policy as a matter of law, even though the policy itself states that it admits of flexibility. So that's one example of what I would consider an unscientific basis that really has adverse public health consequences that's embedded fundamentally in law, because this is enacted by at the state level and originates at the level of a federal agency.
And one of the examples that really hit me as a predominantly pedestrian and cyclist, and like so many of the things that you describe in your paper are things that I sort of background noticed all the time. And once I read your paper, it was like I couldn't help but think of how that practice is exactly the thing that's killing people every single day. And one of the ones that really hit me as both an example of like something incredibly dangerous in experience and also kind of so cemented in the sort of normative expectations and kind of self-righteousness of drivers is the right-hand turn on a red.
Yeah, so this is a great example of how, so I should just pause and say, local advocates who try to change the rules to make them more safe always face a wall of resistance from local DOTs and planning commissioners who always want to run lots of studies that cost millions of dollars and take years, and which, by the way, they often then don't implement. Miami-Dade was recently discovered, spent $80 million on traffic studies that they then sat on. But to make the original changes that gave us these highways through downtown and these rules like turning on red is legal and setting the speed limits at 85% and so forth, these were all done with either a thin scientific basis or no basis. So the rule that you're talking about is a product of energy legislation during the 1970s that actually will punish state and local governments by withholding federal energy conservation funds if they don't adopt a rule that allows not just right on red, but actually left on red as well from a one-way to another one-way. These are extremely dangerous conditions for pedestrians because drivers, and this isn't a knock on drivers, I'm a driver, I'm guessing you're a driver. Depending on the circumstances, we're all pedestrians or drivers or transit users. So anyway, a human being can't really size up all of the relevant threats while doing a turn. For a long time, here I could digress, but to keep it brief, left turns were actually banned in cities because the left turn is such an intrinsically difficult typology of turn. But even a right turn on red is difficult. Primarily, the driver is looking to the left to make sure they don't get hit by a car coming from the vehicle lane and can't look simultaneously to the left and to the right, where a pedestrian walk signal is usually timed to coincide with the red light. So meaning they could run over a pedestrian who was walking directly in front of the vehicle with the light, and that happens quite often. So that's an example I talk about in the paper. There are other examples. I think the one that I alluded to a few minutes ago, the definition of an accident. I mean, this is a huge one. So why do we use this term? This is a legal conclusion that something was an accident. If somebody is going double the speed limit and kills a child, why do we call that instinctively an accident? We see this used repeatedly, really almost exclusively in the context of cars. Of course, we talk about accidents in many contexts, but we use it as a euphemism for cars in a unique way, almost the way we use it when we talk about a child having an accident, which of course has a different meaning.
Mm.
That is not, if you will, an accident. That is the product of a significant amount of organization by the auto industry in the 1920s in response to efforts to push back on motor vehicles, which at the time were killing urban children by the thousands. In 1922, there was a march of 10,000 children in New York to protest these so-called motor killings. 2 years later, there's an editorial on the front page of the New York Times with a sensationalized cartoon accompanying it with a reckless motorist driving over dead children. It was a different time. Peter Norton, who's a historian at UVA, has done really yeoman's work in digging up some of the early histories of our shift over to a car first, really speed first paradigm. Anyway, but this accident thing, it's not just in popular discourse, it's actually in the law. When you if you get into a crash, in most states, some have updated it, most haven't, you actually file an motor vehicle accident report. Those reports, you're also supposed to file one if you're a cyclist and you're in a collision that results in either a certain level of either any personal injury or a certain level of financial damage to your bicycle. Mm-hmm. The form is the same. So this is the second issue, is that the legal paperwork you have to fill out, you have to doctor, because you're supposed to be circling parts of the car that are damaged. You're supposed to be describing the road conditions. Well, there are boxes to check, but different road conditions are dangerous for bicyclists. Some detritus in the bike lane that caused you to go into traffic, that's not dangerous for a car. That there's no box for that. Mm-hmm. So there's a whole sort of back end of the regime that makes it difficult to receive equal rights.
And I really couldn't help but feel, reading your paper, there's a way that the subtle structuring of the law feeds into and reinforces people's sense of their entitlement and the way they're entitled to drive, that just exacerbates massively the kinds of incredibly dangerous behaviors that you're talking about. Like you gave a very, I think, charitable description of the kind of right on red problem. I mean, my experience has often been that a non-trivial percentage of drivers seem to believe that they are entitled to essentially have right of way over pedestrians, even in the crosswalk, when they want to make a right turn on a red light.
Yeah, I think that's right. That's sort of an overdetermined problem. Meaning there are too many causes to really sort them out. But I do think law is part of that. We have a licensing regime that is incredibly lax, basically everywhere in the country. I don't know how many states teach you that you are actually required to yield way to a pedestrian in a crosswalk, and that a crosswalk is defined a little differently state to state, but generally as a way to cross the street at an intersection where there are curb cuts, those ramps on either side of the street, mm-hmm. whether or not it is marked, whether mm-hmm. or not there is a signal with a pedestrian signal. That is a legal crosswalk, and that could even be mid-block. It doesn't even have to be at an intersection. Sometimes you'll see those curb cuts in that circumstance. My mom used to say, when we lived off of a major road when I grew up in Michigan, and we would sometimes walk into the middle of the road and wait for traffic to clear on the other side. And she used to say, you have to be born on the other side of the road, which it did feel that way sometimes. We were doing that at what was a legal crosswalk. I don't think drivers know that. And that is partly a function of law, because we don't require drivers to know that, and we don't enforce crosswalk violations.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that was something as well. It's like, it's one thing to say, oh, it was an accident, which I agree with you. It's just such a bizarre formulation when someone's driving recklessly or negligently. It's an accident that was predetermined to happen because of their mm-hmm. behavior. But it also seems like there's such egregious unenforcement by the police of everything from from speed limits all the way down to all of those other kinds of, again, incredibly dangerous traffic behaviors that, they don't injure or kill someone every single time, but allowing people to do it and not stopping them from doing it just incredibly, increases the risks of those kinds of injuries and deaths.
This is probably part of a larger conversation, which I would love to get into at some point. I couldn't agree more. This is one reason why advocates have turned away from enforcement as a goal. Not that it's not important, but the focus now is on design. So making streets comply with something called Vision Zero, which is originally a Swedish program to eliminate traffic fatalities and serious injuries. That's something that federal DOT, so US DOT, has signed off on, as well as over 40 states and cities in the US. And the only way to get there, we're not going to arrest our way to that goal. There aren't enough cops, and frankly, do we even want that? Where we live in a world of hyper enforcement. But rather, we can design streets according to the Vision Zero standard. And there, if you go to visionzerostreets.I believe it's org or com. You can see some examples of this. It's a rare case where a podcast is not the best vehicle for explaining it. But here we're talking about narrowing the length that a pedestrian has to cross the street by doing what's called a bump out so that the distance is shorter. This gives the pedestrian more comfort. It also cues cars to look to a smaller zone of conflict when they're turning or proceeding. It calls for road diets, which are shrinking the width of the road, often to back what it was before it was widened in the 1950s. There's a whole set of reforms. I think we should also talk about whether we even really want the police doing traffic enforcement. It's not clear to me that the same agency that turns up when you've got a burglary is the one you want stopping people for turning, making an illegal left turn. So that's, as I say, I think that's part of a broader conversation, but to maybe touch on a couple of these other subsidies that are a little less, maybe less obvious to folks. So another huge category is land use. So we have primarily at the local level, a thicket of land use rules that basically outlaw city building in the United States. There's no city in America you could build today under current zoning rules. There are even some cities like Somerville, Massachusetts, where I lived. I was a fellow at Harvard before moving out to Iowa, has 80,000 people. 22 of its buildings you could build today lawfully under its zoning code at most. That's a charitable view of the current zoning rules. So we have these charming, old-timey kind of downtowns and historic neighborhoods that are much beloved, and now the property prices are through the roof because there's so few of them. And they tend to be so close to job centers. And it's illegal. Literally, you will go to jail if you build a building. You won't be able to get a permit. And then if you try to do it, they will cart you off to jail. So that's a slight dramatization. But the point is, through Euclidean zoning, which originally had a racial element known as racial zoning, or a racial counterpart known as racial zoning, which was struck down, but has been incorporated de facto through Euclidean zoning. And this is use zoning.
What is Euclidean zoning?
Yeah. So that's what says, you can't put a business, you can't run a dentist's office out of the back of your house, or you can't put up a multifamily apartment building in a neighborhood of single family homes. It might sound kind of benign on the, in the abstract, or maybe even a little misguided, but not perverse. But it's actually extremely pernicious. What it does is, and what it did starting from the very beginning, it's not like this is new. We just don't see it because it's already happened. It put uses that had negative externalities, like heavy industry and so forth. It pushed those to black and brown neighborhoods and poor white neighborhoods. And it also prohibited people from building larger buildings in established wealthy neighborhoods. The only way that normal people can afford to live in extremely desirable areas is through density. Think about what it would cost to build a big house, like a Home Alone style home, in the middle of Midtown Manhattan. Right? Cost a fortune, not because building it would cost all that much, but because the land could otherwise be occupied by a skyscraper, and the owner of the skyscraper could charge astronomical rents to people all the way up the building. So in order to outbid for that land, you need more than one person. You've got to have a bunch of different people who are able to pay into that end product. That's density. That's population density. That's how poor people and middle class and even upper middle class people can access the agglomeration economies of the 21st century, but also historically, that is how cities have achieved scale and how society has really functioned. And so it's only for the last 100 years that we've had these restrictions. We had plenty of other social problems, as you know, but not this one. This is a creature adapted to the Jim Crow world, and then later adapted again to the Brown versus Board of Education world. And I could go on about the racial elements, but just on the form factors. So we have something called floor area ratios, as well as minimum lot requirements. These are ways of restricting land use that require people to build on large plots and only to do it with single family homes. Most housing in most cities in America is single family homes, single family detached houses. That's true in almost every city in America. And even in places like New York, where you would think that is not the case, you get out to Staten Island, you get out to Queens beyond the subway, and Brooklyn as well, and parts of the Bronx, and you'll find loads and loads of single family homes. Even so, New York is a little unique, but what I'm saying is still true for San Francisco, Seattle, and many other cities that we think of as being very dense and very big.
Yeah. No, I mean, and clearly this means that there's a bias in favor of driving because people don't have an alternative.
Thank you for picking that up. Yes. Right. So, that's absolutely right. You know, when you live, a mile even from the closest grocery, or even 3/4 of a mile, how often are you going to walk? And of course, it's not just the distance that matters. It's also the environment. When I clerked for a judge in Houston, and I lived a mile, I went down there for a weekend, grabbed an apartment. It was a mile from the courthouse. I was all happy about it. I had to jaywalk across a freeway off ramp every day in order to do the walk. And then while I was walking, not on the jaywalking part, but the rest of it, people would pull over and ask if I was okay. They wondered why this sort of overdressed person was walking when I didn't seem to be unhoused. So it was just crazy. But yes, so the net effect of all of this anti-density regulation is to force people to drive, and that's yeah. The word jaywalking is itself an invention explicitly of the auto industry of the 19 teens and 20s. So as you can see, it's I've apparently absorbed it. Can't get it out of you completely.
Yeah, well, and that was a fascinating part of the paper where you kind of talk about the development of the ideology of the automobile as sort of like training and reifying the idea that automobiles are normal and everything else isn't.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think that's tremendously sad. If I can just say, as somebody who now, I grew up in the Midwest and now I'm back in the Midwest, and I think the conversation among urbanists on some of these issues can take on a little bit of a cloistered tone, where people in New York are talking to people in San Francisco, that kind of thing. This affects everybody. About half of the pedestrian deaths in the United States every year occur on highways. Most people are not walking by the side of the highway. Now, sometimes they are, because we do a terrible job of building safe walking infrastructure next to state highways. And state highways here sometimes have speed limits that are, low enough that it wouldn't be crazy to walk alongside it. And in small towns, I can say, having been to some of them, especially in Iowa, sometimes the main drag is actually a state highway. So, some people are really walking on these roads, but a lot of them are not. They have cars that have broken down. And they're dealing with that, or they're state troopers. There's been a huge jump in deaths of state troopers usually on the side of highways. That's not a huge number numerically, but it is a disturbing trend.
Mm-hmm.
So we're all pedestrians at some point. Even walking to your car in a parking lot in a strip mall, if you are struck by a motorist and killed, you will be classified by the statistics as a pedestrian. So, we're all pedestrians at some point. And moreover, cars and our transportation system, but specifically cars, are the number one contributor to greenhouse gases in the United States now. We've made just about everything more efficient. We haven't made driving more efficient. We've made fuel economy of literal cars more efficient, but people have shifted to SUVs, and car companies have exploited a loophole in our environmental regulation to encourage that. And so our overall level of car emissions is flat to rising. So this is a huge problem from a climate perspective. It also has these safety ramifications. We should want people to walk, to bike, to take the bus. We've all been stuck behind a bus and gotten kind of frustrated, but these people on the bus are saving our lives. We really ought to valorize uses of transportation that are socially valuable. And we don't do that. But anyway, even if for the person who's thinking, that sounds kind of nice, but I'm going to keep driving, you're vulnerable too. It's just that if you're killed, it'll be classified as a pedestrian. You may not know that after the fact. But we're all pedestrians. At some point, we should all care.
Yeah. Going back to some of the distributional points that you made, it struck me in your paper, and it's kind of been bothering me for a long time, that in the conversation about kind of trying to change public policy around driving and subsidizing driving, there's this constant refrain of like, oh, well, if we do this, it's going to have, bad distributional consequences for low income drivers. And that just seems to me like to totally miss the point that there's no reason that all these people should be driving in the first place.
Yeah, I think I would go a step further. So what you're talking about is a bigger lift, right? You're saying, as I understand you, in big cities, places that are transit rich, like New York, for example, which is now planning to implement a congestion pricing plan. Why are you driving when you have the subway or whatever as an option? I would go a step further. I think people who sort of gesture at the need for some people to drive are really concern trolling and are actually cloaking themselves in social justice language when that's not their concern at all. The reason people oppose, say, congestion pricing or bus lanes, which in some states are illegal. It is unlawful to add a bus lane in some states and some counties of states. They don't do it because they want the person who's disabled and needs to drive to the hospital to be able to do so, 0.3 of a second faster. If that was what you wanted, you would create a regime centered around that purpose. What they want is for they themselves to be able to drive in an unimpeded fashion. And they know that that's selfish. And so they are just reaching for the first thing at hand. People with disabilities are hugely disadvantaged. They are killed by motorists at a huge disproportion. The chance of being killed for a wheelchair user is 36% higher. Killed by a motorist is 36% higher than the population as a whole. For male wheelchairs between 50 and 64, wheelchair users between 50 and 64, the figure is 75%. So if you're a man, maybe a veteran who's in a wheelchair at middle age, you have nearly a double chance of being killed while you're using your wheelchair than does the average person. And so, the idea that we would defend high speed limits and wide roads and traffic rules that privilege motorists and a criminal law regime that punishes vehicular homicide less than than other types of homicide. And by the way, a tort regime that says negligence, which is a permissive regime, applies rather than strict liability. The idea that we would defend this structure in the name of people with disabilities is bad faith. Frankly, it's outrageous and kind of offensive, but you see it quite often.
Yeah, well, and to add even another, I mean, you point out in the paper that the very design of cars, like, encourages speeding and other bad driving behaviors and increases risk to pedestrians and cyclists.
Yeah, there's, there's a history here, as there is with many of these things. At this point, cars have been part of our culture for about a century. So in the 1920s, during that period I mentioned when people were being killed en masse in cities, especially children. And so a city in Ohio, I can't remember if it was Cincinnati or Cleveland, was debating a regulation that would have required any car coming within the city limits to have a speed governor that disables the car from going over 25 miles an hour. That is really what catalyzed all of the auto interests to come together and self-identify as a constituency. So here I'm talking about not just car companies, but the oil companies, highway manufacturing, tires, service, car dealers. There's, at this point, trillions of dollars a year in the economy invested in the status quo of excessive and risky driving. That's what got them together in the 1920s to take up common cause. Fast forward to today, where we see a proliferation of scooters, primarily Lime and Bird, in some of the big cities in the country. And some cities are now requiring that these scooters be capped at 10 or 15 miles an hour in order to be legal. So it's the total reverse. And they do that without basically any opposition, because there isn't a massive scooter industrial complex the way there was even in the 20s for cars. So they just overnight are passing these bills to cap scooters, which weigh, 20, 30 pounds or less, to cap their speed. But you can drive a 7,500 pound Chevy Suburban as fast as can be. It may be unlawful to break the speed limit, but it's not like Chevrolet is required to cap its speed. That's a non-starter. And so, yeah, in that sense, the design does especially harm pedestrians, since pedestrians don't have a metal cage or airbags, et cetera, around them. But also the design of vehicles, which is regulated by DOT through the through the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration. In 44 countries now, vehicles must be made to be safer to non-occupants, specifically to pedestrians. There are safer and less safe designs for people who are not in the vehicle. And so in most of these countries are in Europe. So in Germany or France or the UK, countries that are our peers, if you sell cars, you have to do so that minimizes negative externalities to the most vulnerable people. And that means the hood will crumple at a certain angle in certain places. They do tests to figure out where people actually fall on the hood when they get hit by a motorist. And so that those areas have to be more responsive, and so on and so forth. These are not on the table in the U.S. There's a UN directive that provides a standard for this. As I mentioned, several dozen countries have adopted it. It's totally, at least thus far, has been a non-starter in the U.S. That's a problem for pedestrians, a big one, but it's also one for non-occupants of the vehicle. So if you are driving a Ford Focus and you get hit by a Ford Expedition, there's a differential in the weight between those cars of something like 5,000, 4,000, 5,000 pounds. Interestingly, so number one, nobody requires that one of those cars be safer as a colliding vehicle. All the design is focused on the vehicle itself protecting its own occupants. And then number two, if you're shopping for cars and you want to compare the safety of these two cars, you won't find any discussion of that differential. The IIHS, which is the best known ratings agency for vehicle safety, the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety. It's a private group. but also NHTSA, which is that highway sub-agency of DOT that I mentioned. They also rate vehicles for safety. They rate by class, not on an absolute scale. And so you could buy a 5-star, top crash tested small car, and it will just get demolished by a larger car. This is something that we maybe have in the back of our mind as intuitive. Certainly at a huge disparity between like a tiny car and like a smart car and a Chevy Suburban, but it's also true really for any car and an SUV. There is I believe is a physician who's in upstate New York, who's done some studies in connection with his medical school of this. And even the top rated, basically you'd rather be in a low rated SUV than a top rated car if there's going to be a collision. And that's how bad the disparity is. And this information is just not out there unless you're digging up public health studies from research websites. It's not publicly disseminated. And that differential is allowed by law. And the total absence of regulation for pedestrians and for the safety of non-occupants is also allowed by law, as opposed to our European and other counterparts where it's legally required.
Yeah, and one of the things I found like scandalous in your paper is the way that you point out that like in addition, this kind of increased sense of safety that people have to themselves when they're driving actually can make them more reckless with respect to other people. Yeah,
that's a real problem. That's a problem on several levels. So you do have a false sense of security when you're driving. The human brain just cannot process all of the full universe of conflicts that can arise while driving, especially driving above like 25, 30 miles an hour. You can imagine your vision of what you can see and what your brain can process in enough time to avoid hitting it. So imagine a circle kind of extending forward from your car windshield. So the faster you go, the more that circle is shrinking. And that's why when somebody gets hit by a car, often the driver will say, they came out of nowhere. Well, they probably didn't come out of nowhere. You probably just didn't see them because you were going too fast. Maybe you were even going under the speed limit, but that does not mean that you were driving at a safe speed in light of the conditions. So that's part of it. People have a false sense of security. They also have the protection of airbags and seatbelts and so forth. There are some studies suggesting that people engage in what's called risk compensation. It's a form of moral hazard where, because they feel safer, they take more risks. On net, that probably works out for the people inside the car because you're better off with the airbags and the seatbelts and all the rest. If you're outside the car, you don't benefit from any of that. So it's all downside. Beyond that, though, there's also this question of excessive driving. So we tend to think about reckless driving. We don't talk enough about that. We talk about distracted driving and drunk driving. We don't talk about speeding. It's not socially stigmatized nearly the way that the other behaviors are.
Jesus, people brag about it.
Yeah, I made good time. That should be, that's an admission of guilt, not something to brag about. But anyway, we have a conception of reckless driving. What we don't have a conception of, we do for truck drivers, but not anybody else, is excessive driving. For human beings to maintain a consistent focus is just hard. This is a concept known as the vigilance decrement in the psychological and neurological literature. It's a very, that's a fancy way of saying the longer you do something that requires your concentration, the worse you're going to be at it. And so by building in undense ways with sprawl, by basically requiring people to do very long commutes in their cars, we're really locking in a certain minimum number of traffic collisions and casualties, as well as all of the negative climate effects. But the decrement really kicks in for the collisions, and therefore for the fatalities and injuries. And this is just totally absent from the policy conversation that actually urban sprawl is really physically dangerous for people.
Yeah. So Greg, I mean, you've got me totally convinced that this is a really serious problem, and we are, through various and assorted forms of policy, just consistently making the problem worse. But it also seems like a really intractable problem in the sense that there's this whole architecture of law and policy. And even more than that, there's a kind of almost ideology of automobile ownership and of driving that just makes people fundamentally resistant to any alternative, not to mention any other kind of change. So, I mean, in closing, what do we do about that? I mean, this seems such a kind of almost quixotic sort of, crusade in the sense that where do we even start with this?
It's a huge problem. I think it took us 100 years to get into this mess, and I hope it takes us less to get out. But Brian, you and I may not live, even if everything goes right, we may not live to see this be fully corrected. It's that bad. It's that embedded in our economy, in our social institutions, in our laws. That said, I don't want to call myself optimistic. I think that's overstating it, but I see causes for optimism. I'll give you a few examples. So this Vision Zero initiative that I mentioned has really shown great success, where cities have not just pledged their commitment to it, but have actually put real money behind it, have a Vision Zero budget, and have people whose jobs are, their job success is tied to the success of Vision Zero. So New York is the best example. They've really made tremendous progress in reducing traffic deaths as a whole, but also the deaths of most vulnerable road users, pedestrians and cyclists and wheelchair users in particular. The record there has been a little mixed, but I think on the whole, it's very positive, and it's a model for a lot of other cities. They've also done congestion pricing now. That's been marketed as a way to raise revenue for public transit, which it is. It's also talked about as a kind of green initiative, which it is. It will also cut traffic deaths. There are studies of this in other cities that have congestion zones, Stockholm, London, Singapore. And look, when you tax something, you get less of it. When you get less driving, you're going to get fewer people getting killed in car crashes. It's not complicated. So I see that as a model. LA, of all places, is now studying congestion pricing. I think it would actually be even more beneficial in LA because they have such a traffic problem. So I see cause for optimism at the local level in these Vision Zero initiatives and allied initiatives around managing transportation. At the state level, we're seeing some bills to preempt some of the NIMBY ordinances that outlaw dense home building. SB 50 is currently being debated in California. That's the nation's leading piece of so-called YIMBY legislation, yes in my backyard, to legalize the construction of slightly denser homes. We're not talking about skyscrapers. We're talking about 3-4 story apartment buildings for the most part that are specifically close to transit corridors. That seems to be assembling the kind of political coalition that's needed. They made a similar effort. Scott Wiener is the state senator from San Francisco leading that. He made a similar effort last year that failed. He's built up a good coalition this time. We'll see what happens. But I see that as cause for optimism. Again, back to New York, but on the state side, the city has secured, with the assistance of the governor, authorization to add way more speed cameras that they have outside of school zones or in school zones. I think these should be expanded, citywide, but they've radically increased the number of speed cameras and also the hours that they are lawfully allowed to operate. There are lots of restrictions on when these things can operate. So there's some success there. There are plenty of reasons to be pessimistic, but I try to focus on the plus side, partly because we have to make change and we just have to stay motivated and grab on to the progress that we've been able to achieve. And so, will we ever fully undo this damage? I would say not. But if we can get to where Spain is, between in about a 10-year period, recently, Spain cut its traffic deaths by 75%.
Wow.
During that same period, we cut traffic deaths by a much smaller amount. And then since then, our traffic deaths have gone up substantially by almost 30%. So, at the beginning of that window, they had trains, they had buses, okay? They had way better bones in their cities for walkability because it's a really old country. They already had those advantages, and they still had a huge number of traffic deaths. But through Vision Zero type redesigns, better enforcement, more sensible management of the road, of public rights of way, they cut traffic deaths by 3/4. So if we can do that, I think we'll be a lot better off than we are today. We will literally save tens of thousands of lives every year.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Greg, thanks so much for talking with me about your paper today. And really, again, congratulations on this fantastic piece. I really look forward to seeing its impact and to seeing your further work on the subject. And, I really appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks, Brian. Great to talk with you.
He's keeping America moving, keeping America strong, providing the wheels to the future, helping our world move along. He's America's automobile man, marching at the head of the band. He's leading the way to a brighter today, and he's doing all that he can.
All across America he's found his way to a place in our community. He's always smiling and singing his song about America and living free, helping you travel through this changing world, helping you get on your way. He's driving the highways of history, believing in today.
And he's keeping America moving, keeping America strong, providing the wheels to the future, helping our world move along. He's America's automobile man, marching at the head of the band. He's leading the way to a brighter today, and he's doing all that he can.
Some folks think of him only in terms of new cars and weekend sales and next year's models, but there's really much more to his story. He's a real leader here in our community. He believes in the American way, and he's always one of the first to stand up and speak out about how it can be made even better. Yes, he's America's automobile man, and his business is just about as competitive as they come. I remember when he bought that old vacant lot down on the corner and moved his dealership into that new building he put up. I think you could say that he's made more than a sizable commitment and contribution to our city and the economy here. He has 70 people working for him now, and that's a lot of jobs. Some of his employees have been in the automobile business for over 25 years and probably know more about transportation and its future than a government investigating committee. He's proud of those people, too. Yes, he talks about them every day, just as if they were part of his own family. He's concerned about the role of transportation in America's future. Yes, he's come a long way since Henry Ford started it all, and I think that he can be trusted to keep America moving.
And he's keeping America moving, keeping America strong, providing the wheels to the future, helping our world move along. He's America's automobile man. He's a neighbor, he's a friend. He's here to help, and he cares about the things that matter in the end. And he's keeping America moving, keeping America strong, providing the wheels to the future, helping our world move along. Yeah, he's America's automobile cares about the things